Before we get to the story, I'd like to say thanks so much for visiting my new channel. I'm going to be uploading cosmic horror related stories every single day. So if that sounds good, please drop a like and don't forget to subscribe. It means a lot, especially when just getting started. I hope you enjoy the story. Trail maintenance work has a reputation for being simple that it doesn't entirely deserve. The physical part is straightforward enough: clearing blowdowns, reshaping drainage, replacing damaged signage, the kind of labor that produces visible results and requires more endurance than skill. But the supervisory side of it, the part where you're responsible for a trail system covering several thousand acres of forest and everything that happens on it, requires a different kind of attention. You have to know the system the way you know a building you've worked in for years, the quirks of it, the sections that cause problems in specific weather, the places where the terrain creates navigation challenges that good signage can only partially address. I had been supervising the trail system in the Caro district of a national forest in central Oregon for 6 years, which was long enough to know every junction and every viewpoint and every section that hikers consistently misread, and long enough to have a reliable sense of what a navigation complaint looked like when it was a signage problem versus when it was a hiker problem. Most navigation complaints were hiker problems. People who didn't consult the map. People who assumed the trail was going somewhere it wasn't going. People who made confident wrong turns and then reported the trail as mislabeled. I didn't hold it against them. Navigation in forested terrain was genuinely difficult, and I had 30 years of experience to draw on that. They didn't. The complaints that started arriving in late May were different from the beginning, though it took me a few weeks to understand how. The first one came from a group of 3 hikers who had been walking the Ridgeline Loop, a trail I knew as well as any in the district, a 12-mile circuit that was well marked and had been hiked by thousands of people without significant navigation issues. They reported ending up in a large clearing that wasn't on the trail map, spending about 40 minutes in it before they were able to reorient and find their way back to the marked trail. They described it as perfectly circular, much larger than any natural clearing in the district, with a ground cover that didn't match the surrounding forest. I read the complaint and logged it under the signage inspection queue and went out the following week to walk that section of the Ridgeline Loop, looking for the deteriorated marker or the obscured junction that had sent them off course. I walked the full section twice and found nothing wrong with the signage and no junction that could have produced the detour they described. I didn't find the clearing. The second complaint came from a solo hiker on a different trail entirely, the Caro Creek route on the eastern side of the district, reporting the same experience. A clearing, circular, large, unfamiliar, ending up there after following a trail she knew well and had walked multiple times previously. In her complaint, she mentioned that she had tried to photograph the clearing and that the photographs hadn't come out right, that they showed something different from what she had been looking at, which she attributed to her phone's camera struggling with the light conditions. I read that complaint on a Thursday afternoon and sat with it for a while before I moved it from the signage queue to a different folder I created for it, which I labeled as pending investigation rather than giving it a more specific name, because I didn't have a more specific name for what I was investigating. By the middle of June, I had 7 complaints with the same destination. Different trailheads, different intended routes, different experience levels among the hikers, and the same clearing at the end of the unintended detour. The geographic spread of the affected trails ruled out a single trail junction problem. The routes in question were on different sides of the district and shared no physical connection that would explain why they were all producing the same misdirection. I pulled the trail maps for every affected route and traced each one against the reported deviation and couldn't find any common feature, any shared physical characteristic of the terrain or the trail design that would explain why they all went to the same place. I decided to walk one of the affected routes myself. I chose the Ridgeline Loop because I knew it best. Picked a Tuesday morning when the district had light visitor traffic and walked the section where the first complaint group had reported the deviation, paying close attention to the trail's relationship to the terrain around it. The trail felt right for the first mile, the familiar route behaving the way it always behaved, the junctions clear and the markers where they should be. Then it felt slightly different. I want to be careful about describing this because the feeling was subtle, and I am a person who is professionally skeptical of subtle feelings as navigation guidance. A slight sense of the trail bending in a direction that didn't match my internal model of where the trail should be going. The kind of drift that disoriented hikers reported and that I had always attributed to fatigue or inattention. I checked my GPS and the trail position matched the map, and I kept walking, and the feeling persisted. A gentle, consistent pull toward a bearing that wasn't the trail's documented bearing. 20 minutes later, I was in the clearing. I hadn't taken a wrong turn. I had followed the trail markers and checked the GPS twice and stayed on what every navigational instrument I had confirmed was the correct route, and I was standing in a clearing that wasn't on any map of the district. It was large, larger than the complaints had suggested, or rather, the complaints had given me a size, and standing inside it made that size feel different than it had reading about it. Perfectly circular in a way that I stood at the edge of and turned slowly through 360 degrees to confirm because the circularity was too precise. The edge of the forest forming a clean arc around the clearing's perimeter that no natural clearing formation produced. The ground cover inside it was a low uniform growth that I didn't recognize from the surrounding forest, a dense mat of something that muffled my footsteps in a way the forest floor outside didn't. The stillness was what I noticed most, not the absence of wind, because there was wind. I could hear it in the canopy above the surrounding trees. The clearing itself was still in a way that the wind wasn't accounting for, a stillness that the open space should have been the last place to find, open ground in a forest being where the wind collected rather than where it stopped. The clearing was still the way an enclosed space was still, a room rather than a field, and I stood in it for about 5 minutes before I decided I was done being in it and walked back out. The trail back was where it was supposed to be. The GPS tracked correctly on the return. The clearing was behind me, and I didn't look back at it, and I was back at my truck in the time the walk should have taken, and I sat in the truck for a while before I drove anywhere. I spent the next 3 weeks doing what I should have done after the first complaint, which was mapping every reported incident against the district's trail system with enough precision to see whether the affected trails had anything in common beyond their shared destination. I plotted the deviation points, the specific locations where the hikers had reported first sensing they were off course, against the trail positions and the terrain features and the GPS coordinates from the complaints that had included location data. The deviation points were not random. Each affected trail curved from its documented course, beginning at a specific point, gradually enough that you wouldn't notice it while walking, consistently enough that the aggregate data made it visible. The curves all oriented toward the same bearing. The trails weren't delivering people to the clearing by accident. They were bending toward it, each one, as if whatever was in the clearing had a gravity that the trails were responding to. I brought this to my colleague, Fetch, who handled the district's trail planning and had the GIS skills to verify my mapping methodology. And he confirmed the analysis and said nothing for a while, and then said that he wanted to see the clearing before he helped me decide what to do about the analysis. We went on a Friday morning with full survey equipment, compasses and GPS units, and a camera, and the kind of methodical documentation mindset that professional fieldwork produced. The compass didn't work inside the clearing, not consistently, not in the erratic way of interference from mineral deposits, but wrong in a stable and reproducible way, pointing south when north was demonstrably in the other direction, the needle holding its incorrect bearing with the steadiness of a compass that was working perfectly and pointing at something that wasn't north. The GPS produced coordinates that Fetch checked against the district map 3 times before he said, quietly, that the coordinates didn't correspond to any point in the district's coordinate system. Not inaccurate, not drifted from our known position by the margin that GPS error produced. Coordinates that placed us somewhere that wasn't the district, that wasn't the forest, that Fetch couldn't place on any map he had access to on his phone. I raised the camera. The clearing through the camera's viewfinder looked different from the clearing I was standing in. Not dramatically different, not a completely different place. Different in the specific way that a photograph sometimes looks different from reality. The framing changing what the eye emphasizes, except that what was different in the viewfinder wasn't about framing. There was something in the clearing center that the viewfinder showed that I couldn't see when I looked directly at the same spot. Not clearly, not with enough resolution to describe with any precision. Something that the camera was resolving from the light of the clearing center that my eyes were not. I lowered the camera and looked at the center of the clearing, empty. I raised the camera, not empty. Fetch was looking at his phone's camera, which he had been using to photograph the ground cover, and he saw me doing it and did the same thing. Raising his camera and looking at the center of the clearing through it, and then lowering it, and then raising it again, he put his phone in his pocket and said he wanted to leave. We left. The incident report I filed covered the navigation anomalies, the trail deviation analysis, and the compass and GPS behavior inside the clearing, and I was careful and precise in how I described all of it, because I needed the report to be taken seriously, and I understood that the line between a report that got taken seriously and a report that got filed under hiker error was thinner than the content of the report and thicker than the credibility of the person who wrote it. The Forest Service review took 6 weeks and found no trail alterations and no signage issues and no physical explanation for the navigation complaints and recommended reopening the affected trails with additional directional signage at key junctions. I submitted a written objection to the reopening recommendation that went nowhere in the administrative process, in the way that written objections usually went nowhere when the institutional momentum was towards a conclusion that was easier to manage than the alternative. The trails are open. The clearing is still out there, still not on any map. And I know from 2 incidents since the reopening that the navigation complaints have continued. Different hikers, same clearing, same destination at the end of a walk they didn't intend to take. Something moved into that clearing at some point before late May, and when it arrived, the forest oriented toward it the way a room orients toward something that suddenly occupies its center, and the trails, which are lines drawn through the forest by human hands, stopped caring about where human hands had drawn them and started caring about where the forest was pointing. I think about the camera sometimes. The difference between the center of the clearing through the viewfinder and the center of the clearing with the naked eye. Whatever is there, the camera could see it, which means it has a physical form, which means it's real in the most basic material sense. It's just that looking at it directly doesn't work. You have to look at it through something else. And I've thought about what that means. What kind of thing exists in a way that instruments can resolve and eyes cannot? And I've thought about it long enough to have stopped expecting to find a comfortable answer. The trails know where it is. They've been trying to show people since it arrived. The Forest Service added more signs,